Today I'd like to share with you an article about transness from 1991 as sort of a trip through time to see how our opinions today compare to queer people's opinions 30 years ago. But before we get into that, I'd like to add the context of the magazine that it was published in. In the 1970s and 80s, there's a cultural awareness of bisexuality forming in America. You have groups like the Bisexual Liberation Front forming, you have the Bay Area Bisexual Network forming, you have several suspect articles being published by major news organizations. In 1974, you have Time magazine publishing an article about the emerging bisexual population, commenting on how clitoral orgasms, the availability of birth control, and developmental trauma is causing the explosion in population. They also propagate a lot of the stereotypes about bisexual people that we know today, that they're hypersexual, that they're more likely to cheat, that their identity is just a phase in this part of their life and they're either going to be straight or gay. Stereotypes that are only made worse by the AIDS epidemic and bisexuals' proximity to straightness. They are seen as a threat to heteros, so everything about them is worse now. And this is where Anything That Moves comes in. The name of the magazine being a play on the idea that bisexuals will have sex with anything that moves. But in this context, it is meant to mean that they will publish any article that will move the needle on society's perception of bisexual people. And in issue number 3, they invited a trans woman to come speak on gender and sexuality, which I find fascinating. Because sometimes we forget that things are not as they always have been. That queer people in the 90s will have different beliefs and worldviews than queer people today. And this article, being just a baseline introduction to gender and sexuality, gives us a great place to compare. Like the very first sentence, gender and sexuality are often confused with one another. This is a sentence that we can hear and nod and apply to our modern world. But I think that would lead to a misunderstanding of it. When I think of how we would apply that to modern times, I think of masculine women that are presumed to be lesbians, or alternative dressing people always being assumed to be bisexuals, which fails for me in 2 ways. One being that it vastly overvalues gender expression and gender identity. A masculine woman is not a different gender identity than a cis woman. It's still a woman that presents differently. It's still one gender. And the second way is that I don't believe she's saying that people think they're just really similar and related. She's saying that they think they are the same, which is fascinating because it pulls that idea far closer to today than I ever thought it was. If you go back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there is the idea of sexual inversion, which explained homosexuality and gender nonconformity as a disorder of the sex. So a lesbian would be a male inside, female outside. Amazingly, we've almost stumbled our way backward into a modern understanding of trans people, but not exactly. At this time, they're getting to that belief through the prevalence of primordial hermaphroditism, the belief that humans evolved from an ancestor that possessed both male and female sex characteristics, which is a funny thumbprint to see in 1991. But I guess it makes sense because the people who were adults at this time grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and sexual identity as a concept really took off in the 1960s. Very similar to how people seem to have a difficulty with the concept of non-binary identities today, which in fact do get a shout out in the article. Whether you're a man, a woman, or your gender identity falls somewhere in between. It's not exactly how I would word it, not exactly a modern understanding, but I'm giving credit. There's also a section here that I believe to be better than where we seem to be going today. She addresses sex and acknowledges that, like gender, it has an inconclusive definition that can be analyzed many different ways and to be interpreted to be many different things. You can look at it genetically, atomically, hormonally, psychologically, socially, legally, or historically. And she goes on to acknowledge that when trans women transition, they change all of those that matter. She also has an interesting focus on bottom surgery completing a transition. Like, she acknowledges that she is a lesbian in all ways that matter, but since she has a penis, she is in label limbo, is how she terms it. But after she has bottom surgery, she will no longer be there. She would be a full lesbian, which seems to believe that the gender identity in the head is less important than the full physical transition when it comes to certain labels, which is interesting because I don't think that we hold that kind of a view today. The importance of bottom surgery as completing a transition has waned with time. But I love the refusal to see anything as intrinsically male about her existence, that sex can change as well as gender, something that I feel that we are sliding back on a little bit with the growing prevalence of AMAB and AFAB. I am not AMAB. I was assigned male at birth. That is something that happened to me. It is not something that is intrinsic to my identity. Or how she puts it, my history is unimportant to me because I don't live in the past. The last thing I want to look at in this article is that she takes the time to explain the difference between transvestites, transgender people, and transsexuals, and I find that a little interesting. Transvestite she largely describes as heterosexual males who cross-dress, acknowledging some facet of a fetish while leaving a cutout for men who just want to play with gender. Transgender women she describes as having a female gender identity, who are living socially as women and transitioning medically. And interestingly enough, she includes drag queens as transgender women, while acknowledging that the label is a little vague and it's not easy to place them. Maybe she is putting them here instead of with transvestites because she doesn't see drag as sexual. But she also made the cutout for non-sexual transvestites, which is interesting because the modern perspective is that drag queens are just men who perform gender, not that they have large gender incongruity in the first place to need to be placed on a transgender spectrum. Although trans people can do drag, women can do drag, but it's just interesting to see the labeling as a gender nonconforming identity for something we see kind of as an activity now. And then she describes transsexuals basically the same as transgender people, but having had bottom surgery, making them more feminine or more female in some way. I think the move away from several trans identities defined by medical intervention to a single term defined primarily by gender identity, fantastic. The less input we give to medical professionals and our identities, the better. Another interesting thing is that I simply do not have a gendered category in my head for men who cross-dress. I mean, go off, diva, good for you, but men should have the breadth of expression to explore femininity without it being some seismic change to their gender identity. Men can be feminine and it not mean anything. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover. It's just an interesting article and an interesting magazine. It's a fascinating time in history. I'll leave links for you to see the archives that I'm pulling them from. And, if nothing else, just go check out the covers. They're really cool.